Let's do this. I'm actually extra excited to go over this email design system because it takes a lot of the things we've already talked about today and kind of just brings it all together into creating this system where you can very easily create emails. So thank you everyone for sticking around and humoring me to talk about email design systems. I love nerding out about these things. Let's hide that and let's just get to it. So before we get started, who the heck am I? I am Megan. I love to code emails a lot. I spend my days handling the marketing emails and the lifecycle emails for the Cinch email family, which includes industry favorites like Mailjet, Mailgun, Email on Acid, and the newly launched Inbox Ready. And as you can imagine, that means I code a ton of emails, and I needed a way to maintain my templates in a flexible and scalable way to support all of our brands and anything they could possibly need. So before we dive into the code and all the technical stuff, let's just establish what an email design system is. An email design system, according to Will Fanguy from Envision, is a collection of reusable components guided by clear standards that can be assembled together to build any number of emails. And why should you use an email design system? Well, look at this GIF with all this code. Do you really want to have to maintain that stuff all the time? So when you use an email design system, code is less error prone. It keeps your evergreen workflows updated. You can stay on brand more easily, and you can scale your team. One really great example that I've actually had recently experienced is that we brought on a new team member, and she had no HTML experience whatsoever. And I sent her to a Codecademy class to learn some basic HTML, trained her up on the email design system, and she is now creating emails. And it took a day to train her. And she's doing some of our basic emails, and it's been great and so helpful for me. And that's just like one of many reasons to use an email design system. And before we go into creating the email design system, if you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend finding the talks from Email Camp, which was done by Mailjet back in the fall, where Avi Goldman and I did a higher level talk about email design systems. So how do we start creating one? First, do your designs, get together with your team if you're on an email team, and look at your existing designs and figure out what you need, what you wish was different, what you currently have. That's the very first thing we did. I got with our email marketing manager, Julia, and we decided what kind of layouts we want. And then we talked to our senior graphic designer, Francois, and he put all these wireframes and designs together for us so that we could work from those designs to start coding, because you really don't want to go in blind. Now, when it gets time to dive into the code, you want to design the interface. Now, former designers, listen up. When I say design the interface, I am not talking about the design of the email, how it visually looks. I am talking about how the code looks when you are creating the emails. Start from how you want that interface to look and then work backwards from that. Because if you can see how it fits together, you will prevent yourself from falling into like a trap of missing the forest for the trees, and you can end up getting into these situations where you're trying to like brute force your way through and problem solve these really small issues, and you don't want that because you'll end up starting over. That happened to me on my email design system. It's not fun. So see how it all fits together first, and think about how you may want to write some dynamic code if you need to do any value switching. And don't get bogged down in that small stuff because it'll all come together. The next thing you need to do is gather global styles. This will help you figure out how to put everything together so that you can, start putting those styles in as you start getting into the weeds of things after you fit everything together. So your global styles will be things like your logos, colors, typefaces, links. If you are bringing ESP information in, you'll need those personalization tokens, view in browser, unsubscribe links. I work in multiple languages, So I would also look at getting translations done, like footer information for those addresses and things like that. So before we get to the next part, I have a fun story, and I love, love, love telling this story. It was in the early days that components existed in Parcel, and it absolutely saved me. So this is a story about how I coded 53 emails in 3 days. Yes, that happened. So on a Friday night after hours, this was right after Pathwire was acquired by Cinch, we got an email, and it said, we have 17 emails we need coded for a client, and we don't have the capacity to do this. Can you help us? And this came from Cinch Corporate. I was like, okay, 17 emails, doable. We can do that. But 72 hours later, that Monday comes. We need these emails in Spanish also. So that brings us up to what, like 32, 34 emails? And this was my reaction, like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And then I, sat and thought about it, newly acquired company, and let's do it. Sometimes as a graphic designer, you got to make it happen. And it is a time to shine, and you have to take those opportunities to shine as an email developer. And on top of those 32, 34 emails, I was already working on another 20 for events happening in the new year, which brings us up to the 50 plus emails. And you know what? Because of components, it all got done. Components are so incredibly powerful. So if you take a look here, this is my basic template. And everything with the module dash, those are my components. All the regular HTML and CSS and all sorts of different values live in these components. And they're all coded so that I can, put them all in and snap them into place where pretty much wherever I need them. Much how you can do that with your Lego bricks and put it all together to build your email. Like you would take your Lego bricks and, I don't know, build your Harry Potter set or your Friends set or whatever other, Lego set that you like. So I'm going to do a quick breakdown of some of these components. This is not an exhaustive list of all my components. I have a lot, but these are pretty much the basics. So in my base module, that has other components pulling in like CSS. It has my wrapping table, wrapping divs, like all that sort of thing. Anything in the head with your different web fonts to bring in, all that jazz, all goes in the header. I have my pre-header, which is our preview text. Our pre-header and preview text are always the same. I also have my view and web link in there, and that never changes, so I don't need it to be editable. I also have an MSO container that's for Outlook to make sure everything looks good there. Our header holds our logo and a couple of other branding items, lines, colors, that sort of thing. A card that controls my background in case I need to change the background color for whatever reason. Row, self-explanatory. Anytime there's a new row. Our columns, my columns are flexible so that we can do multi-column layouts. And our buttons, which are just our button CTAs. And I have like primary and secondary versions of that. So those are pretty much my main ones. We also have a hero image module, logo stuff, image stuff. I hope to at some point combine the hero and the image into one. I have a call out, which is a kind of interesting module. And I have one specifically for data. So for the purposes of diving into components, we're going to look at my button component here and what drives that. At the very basic code, this is all you need to make a button work. That's it. But I mean, we're going to want to add, our URL, change that primary button text to something else. So how do we go about doing that? As we go through this GIF, it scrolls down. So there was some form input, some CSS, and then our basic HTML. And if we strip it back even further and just look at like the basics of what works, all we need is our link element. So here you can see that we have a couple of words before our attributes. and we will look at those. So if you do the set colon before any attribute, that tells Parcel that the value is dynamic and will be essentially called in via a form input. You have to set those inputs in order to make it dynamic. And the slot tells Parcel that that section is editable. And that's how when we use the email design system, we are able to insert all of our content. And as you can see here, this is what a field set can look like. So we have to establish our brands and a text input so that we can change that URL. And there are a couple other things here to have the button behave in certain ways. And if we had a chance to take a closer look at the component, you can see here how we have our basic link text, and we have the CSS that goes with it. So to swap out our colors, you can see how we have the button-mailjet.primary, but we also have button-eaway-primary. And in our class here, we have a little bit of JavaScript, and that's where our brand, and then we have a variant, which is the primary, can get pulled in. And just as a comparison, we have the email design system code and how that code looks when processed. So this is a link from one of our recent newsletters from Email on Acid. And as you can see, it pulled in our link and pulled in those button classes properly. Another really cool thing about components is that you can nest them, which I absolutely love. This is my module list. And with this, I can use a module list item to build lists in a way where I don't have to worry about adding any special classes or anything like that. If you're familiar with lists.cm to create those bulletproof lists, you generally have to add a class on your first list item and your last list item so everything works correctly in Outlook. This will take care of it for me. So you can see here, we can set the class based on our first child or our last child to put in the proper class. And if we have a couple of list items, the ones in the middle, that is not first and not last, won't have any class on them. And this is how it looks when we code it in the email design system. And this is how an unordered list looks when processed, so that you can see how the class populates. This guy here is not needed, obviously. An interesting thing I came across actually yesterday is that coworker I talked about earlier, who we trained her up in the email design system, has no HTML experience, Slacked me and said, hey, Meg, I need an ordered list. And the email design system does not seem to have one. Well, because we did our due diligence in the beginning and had thoughtfully designed and coded this email design system, an ordered list was actually already available to her. And all we had to do is type in the attribute type equals ordered, and it processes as an ordered list. And we still get those classes incorrectly or in the correct way. So now that we've talked about components a little bit, let's take it to the next level. Contexts are one of my favorite parts of Parcel. It is so incredibly powerful. You are leaving flexibility off the table if you don't use these. Definitely look into context and how they can work for you, especially if you do things like language switching, brand switching, all that jazz. This is really the real magic. So contexts work with field sets to dynamically change your values. You can quickly change information. It holds JSON, so you can start using some simple JavaScript to pull in information. Like I just mentioned, I use it for brand switching, ESP switching, language switching, and audience types. Those are just a couple of the ways I use it. So this is what a general context looks like. You can nest them, and they don't have to hold JSON, but this is how you can call different values throughout your entire email design system. And this is what a context can look like with JSON. Mine includes ESP information and info for the 4 different brands, and it's way too long to show here. So I just did an example one and stripped it way back so you can see in general how it works. So if we take a look, You can see how we have brand 1 and brand 2, and their values are different for their logos, their links, and as we set that all in our email design system, it'll swap it all out dynamically. All right, so let's start bringing it all together. We're going to look at some brand switching, some checkbox stuff, if-else statements, columns, and spacing. And this is where you're going to see the real magic happens. All right, so let's look at brand switching. So here you can see I have the attribute brand, which is set by a context and using my field sets. And as I change that brand attribute, you can see logos and colors and some of the font change. But let's see how this looks outside of just this basic template. When I was coding up all the emails for Email Camp, we used the same template for both MailJet and email on Acid. And all we really had to do was change up our content and logos, colors, all that handled for us. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to worry about messing anything up. It just magically happens. Or maybe it's not magic. I'm using the word magic a lot. Maybe it's brilliance and context. And to show how this works a little bit, you can see on our module base, we have a couple of attributes here. So we have our brand one, which we saw. We have a lang attribute and an ARIA label attribute. And you can see on our containing div, we have a couple of these attributes set. And the attributes on that module base is what drives the changes in that code. And in the field set, you can see how most of them are set as radio inputs. So all we're doing is changing that information. You always have to have one of your inputs checked. That just declares your default, and that's all. So when you're working on this, if you have a default value, you do not have to declare it in the code. So like on this module base, I actually don't have to declare MailJet or the language because that's my default brand and my default language. When we look at the process code for a MailJet email, this is what compiles. So you can see how the brand class drives the style switching throughout the whole entire email. You can see how those attributes come in to drive all those different changes. All right, so let's look at language switching. So here we have the same exact template for MailJet, except the languages are different. One's in English and one's in Spanish. And I have that language context set up and I'm able to call it into other contexts to swap information out dynamically. So I love to do this for smaller pieces of information like a pre-header. We can see it set up for the different languages. And then when we take a look, you can see how the language is different in these pre-headers. And if we looked at the back end of it, the links would also be swapped out to go to the proper places. I do the same thing for footers, for our addresses. Because we're a global company, we have headquarters in different countries. So these addresses also dynamically switch out. And this is what it looks like in the front end. And don't mind that liquid. That's for copyright. And if you have not remembered to switch your copyright out yet, this is your reminder to change it to 2023. And today's a great day to do that. All right, let's look at checkboxes. Checkboxes are super cool. So here we have a fairly typical layout in email with our text on the left, our image on the right, and on mobile, we want to have it stacked with the image on top and the text on the bottom. If you don't set anything up to make this happen for the reverse stacking, you'll end up with that text on the top and the image on the bottom, and usually we don't want that to happen. So we can use a checkbox to make sure that reverse stacking happens. So here I have another attribute called reverse on my row. And if we go into the back end, we can use the checkbox type for the input and a context so that we can call that reverse in wherever we need it. I call them both reverse pretty much for just ease. In this outlined box, we have a ternary expression, which you probably saw earlier in the presentation. And it's all it is a simplified if-else statement. What this basically is saying is that if the component matches first child and the context.reverse is true, add the class bottom. And right underneath that, it says if the component matches last child and the the context reverse is true, then add top class. And that will allow those that to stack. The other really cool thing about that, I'll go back for a second, is the input and the context are actually both done in my row component while my div is set in my column component. And that is so I can set the attribute only on my module row, and then I don't have to worry about setting it in several places on the columns. So it just makes things a lot more efficient. Another way I really like to use checkboxes is on images. Usually you want your images responsive by default, but every once in a while I run into some reason that I don't want a responsive image. Usually that's when I have a smaller image that needs to be in the hero, but it doesn't go full width. So my hero component doesn't exactly work. So I created this responsive checkbox. So you can see again our ternary expression. If responsive is true, add the class image. Otherwise, add the class block. And let's move on to if-else statements. Favorite pastime of email development. Fragments are perfect for if-else statements in Parcel. I prefer using these to write conditionals for MSO code as opposed to divs, because the fragments don't process into the actual HTML. So here you can see, using these fragments, I have to set my Microsoft Outlook tables a little bit manually to get them to work correctly. So this is where we start setting all the conditions. So in this first graphic, you can see how I have the width equaling 1, which is your full width, with a couple of different options for aligning. We also have the table and the table row just opening up on its own, so that we can dynamically swap out that table cell as needed. You can see here how we go through the different image types, or sorry, not image types, image widths, how the width attribute changes. I only have the line set to left because I've not run into a situation where I've needed any of these set to center, so I haven't set any of those. And at the bottom of our code, to close everything out, if our last child, if the component matches last child or the width equals 1, we close out that table. If it's not, then we just close out the cell, so then we can go ahead and open up a new one on another column. All right, so now that we have all that under control, let's control a column width. So again, our trusty inputs with our radio. You can see here I have them all set with number values, from full width being 1 down to an 1/8, 2/3, all that sort of stuff. And we have another context that, for our purposes, we call width map. And here we use some JSON to rename these values into actual words, and that just makes it easier to call them the CSS. So it's easier here to have this all be just text rather than using text and numbers. And in our email design system, that's what this looks like. So we can set our width to be any of those width that we had declared in our field set, and we are in a happy place. And that's what this looks like visually. The other thing we have to do is control our spacing between our content areas, right? So the way I do this is with bottom padding and with the attribute called spacing. I have attributes or inputs going from no padding up to extra large, and that all has padding set in M units. And then on the tables for Outlook, they're all just set in your typical pixels, since Outlook won't read those M units, especially on a div. You can see here we have the row dash spacing dash, and then spacing in the little JavaScript brackets, which can sound a little weird, but when that processes into actual HTML, it'll say, none through XL, whichever one we had declared with that attribute. So I know that's a lot. And you're like, Megan, is this all worth it? Yes, it's worth it. And it's a lot of work. But I think efficiently building more emails in less time with fewer errors is totally worth all the work that it takes to create an email design system, because it has enabled me to do things like code those 53 emails in 3 days. One time I did 20 brand new emails in 2 days, and I supported a new brand in an afternoon. I had created this email design system before Inbox Ready was launched. And when that brand was launched, we had to add it into the email design system. And all it was going into that context, adding in all the information, adding in some new styles, and we were done. It was so easy and just shows how flexible it is. So with an email design system, the possibilities really, truly are endless. It's a chance to play around with things and figure out what you need, and it's challenging, wonderful, awesome work. And you might think I'm done, but I'm gonna pull a Steve Jobs on you and go with one more thing. You can take all these concepts that we just went through for the email design system and use it to make your email development even faster. One of my challenges with creating, especially the MailJet emails, because it's in 4 different languages, was that I'd be creating the email in, say, English, and then I had to duplicate it, swap everything out for the next language, then duplicate it, swap everything out for the next language, and then say something minor would change and you had to go change it everywhere. That's just introducing a chance for error. But what happens if you just code it all up in one component and just set your attributes to change it? So in your component, you can set up your field sets just like you do in your email design system and add your different languages. And then what if you need to target, like do an A/B test or target different audiences? You can also add those types of inputs so you can start swapping things out. So this is an actual context that I wrote for that went with this guy. And you can see how I have things typed out for a customer audience and a prospect audience for a white paper that we sent out back in November. And you can see here how I can still just pull in all those attributes and values like I was with the email design system. It still works even on top of it, which I think is really amazing. And these are just a few of the ways that I used it. And with our content, this was one of the earlier ones. So I used fragments to swap out the different content. What I am actually doing now is assigning each language a column, because a lot of times they're just one column emails. And that column can just completely swap out every single time. So we are continually using the same exact code base for every single email. And it makes QAing it just really that much faster, because if one's good, all you have to do is a cursory look at all the other ones, and they should also be perfect. You can see here, this is finishing up the English version, how we have, our prospect content and we have our customer content. And that is it. I just want to give a couple of really big thank yous. This was my first email design system that I've ever coded, and it was a gigantic project. It took me like 6 months, and Avi just helped me out with like every step of the way, answered so many questions, looked at so many looms, and was just amazing throughout the whole thing. It would not be this way without him. So Avi, here's my public thank you to you. And obviously thank yous go to Naomi for also being amazing and putting on this awesome conference. And my coworker, Julia Ritter, took a look at this presentation and gave me feedback. And one of my favorites, Ann Tomlin, also got a peek at the slide and let me know if things were good or not. So thank you, Ann. I always appreciate it. If you want to be friends, I hope you do, because I want to be friends. Find me up on hit me up on Twitter. Yes, I am still there. I am not switching to another social media network until that place dies. You can also find me on LinkedIn, and I also have a newsletter called It Depends. You can sign up at megbosh.com/newsletter. And I have to get back to my window now.
Megan, This was
There we go.
phenomenal. Again, like I'm blown away by all the speakers today. And I hope that this inspired a ton of other developers' use cases for email design systems. I feel like I want to go create one right now. I mean, I should have one for Parcel, but I am ready to go create one. And so thank you so much. We do have a couple questions. I'm just going to pick them out randomly. I think you briefly touched on this one, but Anne's wondering how you deal with the lengths of different languages.
I don't.
Yeah.
I feel like our languages, it works pretty well. It's a lot of communications we have a localization team. So like if we feel like something is too long, we will ask for alternatives. I really think it comes down to communication with your content team. And if you have a localization team or work with a translation service, to really talk to them and be like, hey, this particular CTA, or a lot of times we run into really long pre-headers, and we'll just ask to change them to something else.
Okay, cool. Next up, is MJML not widely used in the industry?
It is very widely used in the industry. People love MJML. There's a whole Slack workspace dedicated to it. For those who are not aware, MJML stands for Mailjet Markup Language. I actually did not know that until I started working at Cinch. And I knew about MJML for a really, really long time. People love it. On Notes from the Dev, we actually have 2 episodes dedicated to MJML with Nicole Hickman. She does an amazing job explaining it. I personally am a control freak and like controlling everything from end to end on my code. And for our needs, it made more sense to just homegrown everything and code it from the bottom up instead of going to a framework like MJML.
And control freak email devs. What? Fantastic. We have one question, which I think could apply to yourself or anyone in the audience. Does anyone know of any internships for email devs or places maybe to get started? If anyone wants to drop any pointers.
Yeah, if you want to drop, you can always go to emailresource.es. It's a weird, obvious fault. It's a weird URL. There he goes. He just dropped it in. Tons of resources there. I fell into email development, so I don't have a lot of advice there. I've been coding since I was like 12 with basic HTML, and then I learned CSS and slightly more modern web design in college, and then I fell into it from there. So yeah, people are putting resources. That's awesome. Yeah, good email code. That's Mark Robbins stuff. I go there all the time for things. Definitely leverage.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you obviously being the inspiration for this entire event. So again, thank you.